Initially, when I made my Game Gear Sonic video, I didn't have any intention of making a series out of it. Since then, though, I ended up covering the Sonic games on GBA as well as the DS, so it only made sense that I'd eventually need to do a video on the 3DS games. Problem is, I really couldn't cover them properly without being able to capture gameplay footage. For a while now, I've been trying to come up with ways I could pull this off, but as it turns out, I somehow got very lucky and was able to acquire a 3DS with a capture card installed, so now I can finally do it. Today's the day. Let's check out the Sonic games available for the 3DS.
Alright, so as usual, I'm gonna go in order of release. Normally, I'd only be covering main entries and no spin-offs, like racing games or party games for example, but the 3DS is a rare case where a couple of spin-off games are actually much closer to main releases in terms of scope. Then again, I did cover Tails Adventure and Tails Sky Patrol, but those still exist in the same universe as Classic Sonic. I'm sure most of you already know which games I'm talking about, so that's what we're gonna do today. I do, however, want to quickly mention the 3D ports of Sonic 1 and 2. I feel like this video wouldn't be complete without at least acknowledging them, but I don't think enough changes were made to warrant their own segments. Basically, Sonic 1 and 2 were ported to the 3DS, were given a 3D effect, and feature a few quality of life improvements such as the spin dash in Sonic 1 and a level select for both. Apparently these are pretty good ports, but at the end of the day, they're Sonic 1 and 2 on the 3DS. If you like Sonic 1 and 2, and you want to play them on the go, you can do a lot worse than these ports. Hey, by the way, real quick, if you like the video, consider subscribing. About half the views on this channel come from non-subscribers, so it really helps a lot, and it's also the best way to keep up if you want to see more. You'd be surprised at how big of a difference it actually makes. With that out of the way, on to the video. The first Sonic game to hit the 3DS was Sonic Generations all the way back in 2011. Despite sharing the same name as its console counterpart, Sonic Generations for the 3DS isn't a port, but rather an original handheld take on the game built from the ground up, and with the exception of Green Hill, features completely different zones exclusive to the 3DS version, and to be honest, I think I like the zone choices for Generations 3DS a bit more than the console version. The game is set up very similarly to the console version, with Act 1 of stages being classic Sonic's job and Act 2 being played with modern Sonic. But the actual gameplay itself has been changed quite a bit. I guess they couldn't really pull off modern Sonic gameplay on the 3DS, so now, instead of the typical classic and modern that you're probably used to, modern Sonic plays much more in line with how he did in the Rush series. This unfortunately does make playing as classic Sonic seem a bit less enjoyable, but he does gain access to the homing attack later on, which does spice up his sections a bit more. This is probably a pretty polarizing change, but I think it was a good inclusion in practice. After you complete both acts of each stage, you're given access to a special stage where you can collect one of the emeralds. I actually really like these stages. They're pretty similar to Sonic 2's special stages, but a lot more fair. And honestly, maybe just a little too easy, but I still had a good time with them. The bosses in the 3DS version are also totally different, and each boss, save for the final one, are actually a two-part ordeal, with the first encounter being a race against another character, and the second being a real fight against various different bosses from the series, like Big Arm from Sonic 3 or the Bio Lizard from SA2. Now, those boss races kinda suck. Maybe some people have fun with these, but to me, they were just annoying. They're not that hard, but there really isn't anything engaging about them, at least to me, and even when it comes to the story, it seems unnecessary, and I'm really not sure why I'm racing against Shadow and Metal. The actual bosses aren't very hard either, but I do think they're a pretty fun time, even if I do just end up defaulting to abusing the ring system instead of playing well. I think all the bosses are pretty solid except for the final boss, which I never actually beat until now. Years ago, when I played this game, I got up to the time meter, and no matter what I did, I kept running out of rings and losing. It's a long boss fight too, so eventually I just put the game down and gave up, and I almost never do that with a game that I enjoy. Out of all the games I'm going to talk about today, this was actually the only one I played prior to recording footage for this video. I got the game years ago because I played Sonic Generations and loved it, and I thought it was just Sonic Generations on the go. Turns out, it had a bunch of stages in it that I wished had been in the console version, like Casino Night, Mushroom Hill, or Radical Highway. I actually like almost every single zone in this game, except for Water Palace from Sonic Rush. I could go the rest of my life never playing that zone ever again, and I'd be a happier person for it. Back to back, back to back. All in all, I know some people are divided about it, but I think Sonic Generations for the 3DS is a really solid game. Not only is it a great companion to the console game, but I think it's good enough to stand on its own 2 feet as an original game regardless of if you've played the other version. A couple years later, Sonic Lost World came out, and this one, while not being an actual port, falls more in line with the Wii U version. Tweaks were made to the controls and level design, but unlike the usual 2D adaptation of a console game, Lost World 3DS looks and plays very similarly to its Wii U counterpart. Now, I've seen countless people tell me that Lost World 3DS is bad, but I've got to be honest here. I didn't hate it. As the game progresses, it definitely gets a bit more janky and seems to ramp up in difficulty, and not the good kind of difficulty, but I think this game is actually pretty decent, all things considered. Not good, but definitely serviceable. Sonic does feel kind of floaty, so more often than not, precise platforming is a bit anxiety-inducing, but when this game is doing what it does best, which is the typical cylindrical Lost World adaptation of Sonic's gameplay, dare I say it can be decently fun. As far as the story goes, if you know the Lost World story, that's what you're getting here. Only this time it's presented in cutscenes that I don't think could be more compressed if they tried. You might think these just look bad because it's all blown up to 1080p, but no, they looked bad on the 3DS as well. They just happen to look even worse when blown up. Anyway, the story is what it is, and I don't think I've ever met a person in my life who cared at all about the Deadly Six. Sega wants Zavok to be a thing so bad, and he's just never gonna be a thing. There's 7 worlds, each consisting of 3 zones, a boss, and a special stage. Stages vary quite a bit here. There's the gameplay style I mentioned before, pretty much just an adaptation of typical Sonic gameplay. There's 2D stages, which aren't too bad. They're not as good as an actual 2D Sonic game, but I think they do the job just fine and they're relatively inoffensive. The game also starts incorporating some non-linear stages with puzzle elements, and those were alright too. At times it definitely seemed like padding a little bit, but it wasn't too bad. The bosses, like pretty much any Sonic bosses, are easily cheesed via the ring system. I will say though, the fights themselves are kinda interesting since there's more strategy involved than just bopping them on the head. You need to figure out how to beat each of the Deadly Six and then exploit their weaknesses. As for the actual bosses as characters, I never liked them. They look like the Monstars from Space Jam, and each of them have a completely one-dimensional personality, such as Wise and Fat. Now, there is one gameplay type that I need to talk about because I'm honestly shocked at how bad it is. See, the special stages are these free-roaming flying levels where you have to collect a certain amount of orbs in a time limit. Typical stuff, right? The problem is, you don't use the circle pad, and instead the controls are mapped to the gyroscope. Normally, I like gyro controls and almost never have an issue with them, but boy, whoever programmed these screwed them up real bad. These stages had me swinging my 3DS all around the room, twisting my arms in ungodly positions, and praying that Sonic would go in the direction I wanted him to. And for whatever reason, you can only turn so far, so if you move your 3DS too far in one direction, the calibration gets all messed up and you'll need to fix it, which is a problem considering you're on a time limit. It's hard to describe just how bad it is, but just spend like 30 seconds with these special stages and you'll probably get exactly what I mean. And I know someone in the comments is just gonna tell me I suck, but I don't care. This is trash. Anyway, the game seems to run pretty well, considering they didn't make all that many sacrifices when making the handheld version. The only hiccups I really encountered was when I had like a ton of rings and got hit. That resulted in some slowdown. I feel like that's something that should have been fixed considering how often that can happen, but other than that, the game seemed to run fine. Honestly, despite hearing so many people say they hated this game and then dreading it, I ended up not hating it. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely some cheap garbage in here, and there is absolutely a good deal of padding here and there as well, but I think all things considered, Lost World 3DS isn't so terrible. It is absolutely no masterpiece, but you can do a whole lot worse than this, and it's not at all something I'd consider a bad game, except for those special stages. Those are bad. So next up is Sonic Boom Shattered Potential. Crystal. This has honestly been a long time coming. Veterans of the channel will remember I actually reviewed Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric back when it came out, and it was one of the first handful of videos I ever did. By now, everybody knows that game is hot trash, but I always heard the 3DS Sonic Boom game that came out alongside it was much better. Sonic Boom Shattered Crystal really doesn't have all that much in common with the game that came out for the Wii U. Instead of a platforming slash beat-em-up adventure game, it's far more in line with what we're typically used to when it comes to handheld Sonic games. It's a more traditional side-scrolling 2D Sonic game that actually controls pretty well and feels good to play. It's a bit different than most people are probably used to, since in the Boom universe, Sonic isn't exactly the same speedy character he is in the rest of the series. He's still technically the fast one, but it's definitely not the same. The boost from games like Sonic Rush also isn't present here, and the game relies far more on using the homing attack to dispose of enemies. Another main platforming mechanic is the Enter Beam, which sees far more usage in this game than in Rise of Lyric. It's basically a grappling hook that you need to use to swing off of certain obstacles. As you progress in the game, you gain access to other characters whose different abilities need to be used depending on the situation that presents itself. This aspect doesn't really make the gameplay any deeper, and needing to switch characters every once in a while for an arbitrary obstacle that only one of the characters can get through seems to mainly exist to give us the illusion of variety. As for the story, there are some cutscenes, but most of the dialogue is presented through text boxes and static images. Normally, I'd just breeze through stuff like this, but I will give credit where credit is due and acknowledge the fact that the writing is actually pretty funny sometimes, which isn't all that surprising considering the Sonic Boom TV show was written well. Come to think of it, it actually is a bit surprising because as I remember, the dialogue in Rise of Lyric totally sucked and was like an off-brand, corny version of what the show would later deliver, but I digress. Now, for those of you who haven't played this game, you might be wondering why I called the game Sonic Boom Shattered Potential. And for those of you who have played it, you're probably waiting for the part where I tell you the game is terrible. Well, here it comes. Sonic Boom Shattered Crystal had the potential to be a pretty decent and fun game, maybe not the best Sonic offering on 3DS, but commendable and decent. But unfortunately, despite the good controls and mechanics, the entire experience is completely bogged down by one thing. This is not a linear Sonic game. It is, for all intents and purposes, a Metroidvania, and not a very good one at that. See, in the overworld map, stages must be unlocked before you can play them. Normally, this would just require completing a certain amount of prior stages, but Shattered Crystal has numerous objectives within each stage which earns you these gold medals that you need to unlock stages. You get one for completing a stage, sure, but it only takes about 4 stages before you're forced to return to old ones to get more medals. This consists of going back and scouring the map. Yes, I said map, because when I said this is akin to a Metroidvania, I meant it, and collecting a certain number of hidden collectibles. This often requires a lot of backtracking, and the level design isn't exactly conducive to that. Instead of one wide open map, you take these launch pads to different chunks of it. This becomes very annoying and tedious very quickly, because often you may go too far and get blocked off from backtracking, and then you'll need to proceed further in the stage just to send yourself back for something you missed. And it really doesn't help at all that these stages are long, and I mean like 10, 15, or even 20 minutes long, filled to the brim with padding. Sometimes these collectibles are also locked behind really boring and tedious minigames too, which doesn't make the situation any better. In my opinion at least, this game is not very fun at all, it's repetitive and wastes a ton of your time. Actually, before I started playing it, I googled how long it took to beat, and it said 8 hours. Before playing, I didn't understand how it could possibly take 8 hours, but it took about 30 minutes of playtime for me to figure out how. Padding. This game could have actually been pretty fun, but unfortunately, they blew it with this one. To be honest though, having played through Rise of Lyric, it's no surprise to me that Shattered Crystal was considered the good one. At least this game functions. In an unexpected turn of events, Sanzaru Games, the developer of Shattered Crystal, must have heard all the criticisms people had because a couple years later, they released a sequel that fixed nearly every single issue I and a lot of other people had with the first game. Sonic Boom Fire and Ice is a direct follow-up to Shattered Crystal, and to make sure this game was as good as it could possibly be, it was even delayed to make sure it was given extra polish. While it won't blow your mind or anything, this is everything Shattered Crystal should have been. Gone is the progression gating through collectibles. Instead, every single collectible in the game can be completely ignored if you want to. The stages themselves are also much shorter, only a few minutes apiece, and only a few more minutes if you decide to go for the collectibles. Not only are there way less collectibles, but you also don't need to take a huge detour just to grab one. The most the game will really ask of you is to deviate a screen or two, and then it's back to the main path. The environments this time around are way more interesting as well. Nothing to write home about, but definitely more visually captivating than Shattered Crystal. Even the optional minigames have been given an overhaul, like the one where you pilot Tails' submarine to grab treasure within a certain time limit. Not only does it look better visually, but you used to have to grab the treasure and then find your way out. Now all the game asks of you is to find the treasure. Short and sweet. That's the biggest difference with this game. It doesn't waste your time. Now, Fire and Ice gets its name from its main mechanic this time around. For a reason that doesn't really make any sense in the story and just kinda happens, Sonic and the gang have a fire and ice power that lets them manipulate certain parts of the stage, more often than not turning water into a solid platform with the ice ability or melting it with fire. There are a couple times where this did add a good deal of depth to the level design, but unfortunately, it's super underutilized for the most part, and 90% of the time, it's not actually used in a clever way, but rather an arbitrary reason to have to press the R button. That other 10% though definitely shows this mechanic could have made level design super interesting if used properly, but they kinda dropped the ball on this one. The bosses this time around are actually bosses too. All Shattered Crystal had to offer was this on-rails worm race thing. I wouldn't say these are the most intricately designed bosses of the franchise, but they do a good job of switching up the gameplay. Everything about this game moves so much faster than its predecessor. And the best part about it is if you want to take your time, explore, and smell the roses, you can, and you'll be rewarded for it. But if you'd rather blaze through all the stages at breakneck speed to get it all done as fast as possible, you can do that too. The game's controls have been tightened up by a pretty big margin as well. I thought Shattered Crystal controlled just fine, but this just feels so much more polished. It's hard to describe, but playing them back to back, there's no question, and it's immediately obvious. Now, I've got to be fair. Overall, I'd say this game is pretty forgettable, all things considered. I'd say it's a bit better than some of the other handheld Sonic games, but it's probably not gonna be a game you come back to very often, if at all. But I will say, it's definitely worth trying out at least. It did surprise me quite a bit. It may not be amazing, but it's a relatively good game and much better than the other games bearing the Sonic Boom title. If this had been the only game in the franchise, I doubt most people would have many negative things to say about it. I'd say give this one a go, even though, as Ant Dude pointed out to me, Knuckles looks like he ate bees. And that's all of them. You know, going into this, I was expecting to find mostly garbage considering how many negative opinions I've seen over the years, and while I always thought Generations was a good game, Lost World, despite not being good necessarily, ended up not being the dumpster fire I was led to believe it was, and Fire and Ice was something I would even call good. Shattered Crystal, though, there's just no saving that game in my opinion, and it's telling considering literally all of its issues were addressed in the sequel. If you're a Sonic fan and you haven't played any of the games I talked about today, definitely give Generations a shot. And if you're feeling saucy, maybe even check out Fire and Ice. Don't touch Shattered Crystal though, that game's poo-poo. Hey, thank you for watching the video. And if you want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can tap or click on or whatever. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, there's this Patreon right there too.